How's your day?
It's going well. A little lift this morning. Kind of like I'm in like a transition week right now, so nothing too hard. But
Transition from what?
so I'm doing right now. I'm doing James Serby. He runs like Rebel Performance.
Okay.
He I don't know. He programs and doing his stuff. It's only like $30 a month, so I figure it's good and I kind of like it. And it's a lot less volume than mass, and it's a lot. So like I just feel a lot better. But it's like a 3 lift days, 3 conditioning days. I don't know. I like it, but yeah, it's like the 5th week right now, so it's an easy week. Yeah.
Awesome. I'll have to check
What
that
about you?
Yeah, I'm doing Plan Strong work. So I took that course, which is through Strong First, and it's been helpful because it's a nice framework for hypertrophy, strength. But I'm starting to even think about it for other things, and it's movement oriented. And you take one movement and then you just basically divvy up volume for the course of a month, and then the key is that it's varied. So instead of it being progressive overload in a way, you figure out what your percentages are, your intensity zones around based on your 1RM, but then you really are going to be doing the same 3 or 4 weights the whole month, right? And you're randomizing how you're doing that, right? So there's certain rep zones within those intensity zones that you want to hit. So say it's like 75 to 85%. You might do like sets of 3. You want to keep it so it's decently not easy, but you're not getting to failure. Like you're not losing your technical proficiency. And I love doing that as long as I have time for it. What I have to do though is cut out a lot of other stuff. So I'm just squatting, I'm just deadlifting, and I'm just pressing. And but I do feel the benefit, and it just feels good. It's like this stimulation, but I'm not overworking, and I can feel myself get stronger and also more technically proficient with the movement, just because it's a lot of reps that aren't crippling.
Yeah.
And then every 4 weeks I will test myself and then maybe change it up. So I'm experimenting with it because that's the best way for me to learn, like what I took in from the course. But so far I really like it. I always like Strong First stuff. It has that combination of it being effective but never too taxing.
Yeah.
And it fits into my lifestyle very nicely at this point in my life, where I can just grease the groove a lot and just accumulate volume. It's oftentimes very accumulation based. Like the rest, you respect the rest breaks, but you don't really want to rush from one set to it. You just want to accumulate volume, and I can do that throughout the course of the day working in the gym, which is nice.
Yeah, definitely. It's crazy how like I've been compared to what I was doing a few months ago, like on big lifts, not lifting till failure at all, like maybe leaving 3 or more in the tank. Like it just feels better, and my numbers get way better just because I guess I'm in a better zone of like not breaking down or anything, but it sounds similar.
Yeah, and I think it depends on where you are in your training age, right? If you are new to a movement, you could PR like every day, right? And I see that with a lot of my clients because they're all new in many ways, and even if I've been seeing them for a while, they don't have the training history under their belt where they even care about PRs and things like that. So it's like every day, if I have them in a program, I'm building their load until they get to a point where, okay, now it's too hard. Because I don't want to throw them into something that's too hard the first day. So I'm always erring on the side of less. Just feel this. And we can talk about things like breathing and tempo, right? And then the next day they do it, they can do the next increment of weight. And that usually goes on for much longer than it would be for if you have a training age where you already know what your plateau is, what your max is. And now you don't touch that. You do stuff that's way below it in just different variations. But I think that's the difference. It's like, how new is it to you? I know when I was in CrossFit, I would PR all the time just because
Really?
I never worked out like that. Like I never did those movements, right? So cleans and snatches, they were all brand new, and it was a lot of technique building, but it was just like, well, I'd never done it before. So it was just like figuring out how to, spark my hips and things like that. And even squatting, I had squatted in the past, but I never really squatted like that. I never thought about it in the same way. I never programmed it for the same way. So it was like every time I would do a squat day, it would be like, well, I might as well test the PR at the end. And most of the time it would go up and then until it does it. But now at this point, it's like, now I'm declining if I don't do it for a while. I'm decreasing what I had before. So that's where you need something new.
Yeah, definitely. That's so interesting because it is like when you first start training, it's just like, oh yeah, I'll do more weight than last week.
Right.
And you can do that for so long.
Yeah.
And then eventually you hit a wall. But yeah.
That's what this Plan Strong stuff is. It's very ingenious with this, or I just think they take a lot of experience from people that have already been successful and data from people that have already been successful, and then they put it into a nice mathematical procedure, right?
Yeah.
There is math to it, but if you can have a spreadsheet do it for you, it becomes pretty easy.
Yeah. And what is it? It's squat.
Well,
or what are you doing?
I'm doing squat and deadlift, and I was doing bench, but I strained my pec a little bit. So I went to kettlebell presses, which I kind of like kettlebell presses better anyway. I did like the feeling of the bench getting back into it, but it also feels like every time I do a lot of high volume bench, like it's either going to be a shoulder or it's going to be a pec. Yeah. Like it feels like I can't sustain that as well. And pressing, I feel like I can. So overhead pressing with the kettlebell. And I kind of like the idea of having it be one side at a time, like, cause the other ones are so bilateral. So I feel like I'm still getting the stimulus I'm looking for, but it allows me to rotate and turn a little bit better.
Yeah.
Or at least fight that.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
So what do you got today?
So all my questions kind of have to do with learning.
Cool.
In general, but the first one was partially selfish, but it was just, as someone who's just getting started and going down this path, and we've talked about this before in the past, but just about like recommended resources, different things I should be going to or looking into or reading to trying to learn. Just, if we could expand on that just to see, I don't know if there's things I'm missing. I want to try to do what I can here to learn what I can. So,
well, I think you're doing a lot right now, more than most likely. It's a different time to learn now than when I was in school, certainly. And that isn't that long ago, but just with technology and YouTube and how much content there is out there, it's just you can gain so much more information, but you do have to filter it. So one of the things I would say is, it's as opposed to the specific sources, like you already follow good people, but it's more about just conceptually. When you're in school, what I would recommend is when it starts to get hard or like boring, especially if it feels like it's boring, it's like something you're not interested in, and you're not going to absorb that as well if it's boring, right? You're going to try to distract yourself from it. Try to make it make sense to you, and then use technology, use the content that's out there to get a different context of it. And that may become difficult as you have more and more responsibility on your plate, as the credits start piling up when you get into school. But that's I never looked at school as an enjoyable experience, but learning is the most enjoyable thing I think I do right now, other than spend time with my kids. But even being a father is a learning process. So the more you can orient everything that you do around learning, like make that your higher power in a way, it can be very powerful. So then you would look at school as just, well, good. It's like I'm paying to learn. It's the ultimate learning process. But sometimes it doesn't feel that way. Sometimes it just feels like something you have to endure. And that's a big difference, right? So trying to fit it into something that would be contextual in your life is really important. So when you're in PT school, you're going to have something that hopefully all comes together to make you a better PT. You just might not be able to see it yet. Like you won't be able to see why you're doing and learning these things. So if you can try to figure that out, ask questions to people that are already PTs. When something feels boring, try to figure out how it's going to fit in the grand scheme of things and what you're doing. I wish I had that mindset, like with more things. And I felt like it was easier to do when we got into the very specific physical therapy classes. But, things like chemistry and biology and physics, I mean, they're so fundamental to what we do in understanding the human body. So the more you can integrate those things that seem very separate and fundamental, but not connected to what you're doing with the body, the more you can integrate that, it makes everything much more enjoyable, and that's just going to enhance your learning process. So you'll be a more flexible learner. You won't need to have things be very specific, like you have to memorize them. It'll be like you can orient your mind to whatever's coming.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, no, that's definitely very helpful. It's funny because when I was taking physics, I started physics like last fall and took it again in the spring, like part 2 or whatever. But that was just when I started to sort of look into Bill's stuff and get more into that. And it was like, as soon as I started looking into that, like my thought process on like the class just kind of changed to a certain extent, which was helpful. But
yeah. And so I think from a specific subject standpoint, psychology is really important. And what I've noticed is, there's a lot of categories within psychology that can easily be tweaked a little bit and become physical therapy categories or processes, right? So something like desensitization, if you look that term up, it'll be more of a psychology term, but, obviously, like, it's something that we're doing on a regular basis when we're working with people tolerating pressure, tolerating load, the idea of adaptation, that all fits into there. So understanding psychology principles will really carry over from both directions, right? Like for what you're going to have to deal with. One, just understanding how it relates to physiology and the nervous system as a whole. So when we're thinking about psychology, we're usually thinking about like the brain and its processes, which is just the motherboard of the nervous system. So how does those broad concepts or methods to helping people from a psychology perspective maybe carry over to the physiology of the body separate from the brain, which doesn't really exist, right? So, because everything is integrated through there. But we can start thinking about it in maybe more physical therapy terms, and I think I've seen a lot of connection there. The other thing is say you look into something like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is traditionally for psychologists, like they'll practice that, and that's something that they're specialized in, and people will come to see them specifically for that. If you get just at least the bare bones of that, maybe take like some type of online course along those lines, you're not going to necessarily say, okay, this is what I'm offering, but you'll understand it in a way that even the psychologists don't, right? So because you're working with physical pain, right? You're working with an orthopedic population or people that are in chronic pain. So you'll have this connection that you'll be able to make with your clients that the psychologists themselves aren't seeing, because they're seeing more specific psychology diagnoses. And that's one of the things I noticed. Like I did a CBT course, and it just to get a sense of it. I was hearing good stuff about the research there, and I know how important this psychology is when you get people that are in chronic pain, but just also getting people to do the things you want them to do from a compliancy standpoint. And what I found interesting, it was very obvious to me how it would link to what would be thought of as orthopedic pain. But for the individuals that were the actual psychologists, like taking the course, as soon as you start talking about orthopedic pain, immediately the behavioral stuff goes away, and it becomes about the structure and the orthopedic idea. So it's interesting to me that even the people that are in that world don't necessarily connect it to pain or anything that would be orthopedic. Like pain is structure when it's that way, and we know that there is at least some intertwining going on there. So the more we understand psychology, the more it becomes clear, I think, how we have to help people, especially in circumstances when stuff's a bit more chronic and it's obviously not specific to a tissue injury, which happens a lot.
Yeah.
And if you're not in tune with that, then you force things into a structural bubble, and then it ends up being the patient's fault in some way, right? So I think it opens your mind to many possibilities, and that you're treating not only the whole person, but you might be treating an entire lifestyle. You can only do your scope, but if you don't even think of it from a lifestyle perspective, then you're going to be unsuccessful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we've gone down a bunch of times that rabbit hole of like structure doesn't equal pain, but how do you find that course?
So CBT is big in the Philadelphia area because I think that's where it started. So I just searched on the website CBT, and then they offer like online stuff.
Okay.
It's pretty easy to do. I actually asked about going through a certification because I'm a certification guy. I think that's slowly declining because I have to recertify a lot, and that costs me a lot of money. But I've always liked going through the full process of something, especially if it's not that difficult to do. But I inquired about it, but I needed a background in psychology. Like I needed an education in psychology to do that. So you could at least take the courses and you get like a little certificate that says you did it.
Yeah.
And I found it valuable, and I would do that again with other topics in psychology. Like the more I feel like I know about that, I can connect it. It's not like I want to do the same thing a psychologist is doing at all. I just want to connect it to things that I'm seeing, in my clientele. And it's definitely important because you're working with the human, right? And to think that their psychology is somehow not involved is just, it's out. It's obviously fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess you touched on a little bit just going to that course, but so then what's your own learning process look like these days?
So it's always changing, but I would say like I'm always trying to find broad categories, and I think that's a common thread that's certainly not unique to me at all. And you'll find a commonality in good methods that are easy to utilize, that they have some form of broad categorization. So let's just use Bill's method, right? Like it's expansion and compression, and then there's a lot of other stuff that he does really well at categorizing. So he just talks about like the foot as the rocker, like the toe rocker, the heel rocker, the ankle rocker, right? So looking for those broad categorizations are super valuable. And in order to do that, though, you need to go into any process with a very open mind to say, like, there's going to be stuff that maybe doesn't fit with where I'm at currently. There might be the person teaching it might just not jive with you because of ego issues or just something that just doesn't mix with what your values are. But there's something that you're going to be able to gain there that you might be able to put with something else you learn down the line. And that's how you start to build your broad categorizations, is the way I like to look at it. So the certifications that I've gone through, you can find common threads, and then that allows you to really develop your own model in your head of commonalities. And so from that perspective, like, to get more broad is, I think, a great way to learn. And then you can get more specific when you need to. But if you don't know how to get broad, then it's like you have to learn every little thing instead of understanding it from a more broad perspective that you can say, oh, I see how this fits here. Okay. And then it makes more sense to go specific because you already understand it from a broad perspective. Right. So that, I think, is huge. Is just always look at it as like, what's the theme here? What's the main points? And that's something that you learn in school, right? I look at it back to like English class when you have to read something and you have to find the main topics and the broad themes, and you can kind of ignore all the other stuff, but can you just figure out what the main topic is here? Like what someone's trying to get across, not what you feel about them personally, not how if someone rubbed you the wrong way, not even if it went against your beliefs, right? Because I don't think learning is about beliefs. I think it's about just taking stuff in, very objectively, like as an observer, and then you can start to say like what's useful, what's skillful, because you don't know when something that you've heard before is gonna be, oh, that's skillful now. That was something I didn't think was valuable at all, and the more you judge it as not valuable, the less you'll ever have the opportunity to use it. So my learning process is to try to always like stay open to that, I guess. And but I think of it as like you more specifically, more practically, like you have your information gathering, right? So that would be taking in content, books, right? YouTube stuff, podcasts. I do a lot of that via audio because it's just easier for me. And I think even having a YouTube video versus just having somebody take their YouTube video and putting it on a podcast, like I'll listen to the podcast because I can do that while I'm doing other things. And then if I need more of a visual, I'll go back and get the visual. So I've been doing that with Zach Couple stuff, with Bill stuff. And it's a really good way for me to just get caught up really quickly. I mean, I can go through audiobooks 2 or 3 a month where I might not read more than 2 books a year, right? So it's just from the standpoint of I like reading when I have the time, but I also like being productive, and it's a stress reliever for me to be taking in information while I'm also doing other things. Yeah. Because if I feel like I have to sit still and read, I know I have a lot of other stuff on my plate. I'm going to be antsy. You know what I mean? I'm going to be antsy with that. And it is nice to say, like, when I don't have other shit to do, like on the weekends, that's when I'll sit down and read and take information in that way. But a lot of times I don't want to do stuff that's oriented to work. I want to just have it be kind of more of a relaxing thing there. But that you get the content gathering, like your information gathering, and then it is actually like creating your own process, right? So creativity time, right? So you take what you've learned and you make your own model. And I don't think it's too early to do that for anybody. You might not feel confident like putting it out there to sell, but especially with the free YouTube, you can just put stuff up on YouTube for free, right? Yeah. You make your own content, and that helps you figure out your own model. Or just writing, I think, is so valuable, and I'm realizing that now. So currently, my goal is to write a little bit every day, and I've written a book that is not meant to be successful or anything like that, but it was a super therapeutic process. Yeah. And talk about a learning process, though, because you have in your own head your model of what you think you know and what you tell people every day. But when you have to write it down, you have to research it much more, right? You have to make sure that it's much more coherent, and it just takes much longer than you think. So the process is, as I'm thinking about what I'm going to write, well, as soon as I hit like a snag, I'll be like, well, where's this source coming from? And then I have to stop and look that up. You realize that a deadline is not going to be something that's valuable for this process. So just thinking about writing every day helps you get to a point. It doesn't matter what you finish, but just writing every day, you will now have this process built in for learning every day too. And I'm just starting to appreciate that more and more. So, videos I think can be helpful too, because you learn about the public speaking process, you learn about how to communicate verbally. But writing, at least for me, is a grander process of like, I can take my time with it a little bit more. And then that will connect me to research, that will connect me to even just broader context. Like I use Wikipedia a lot, to be honest with you, just to get like, what's the base? Yeah. Without having to go deeper, like what's being said. Because I don't even think people have an understanding of some of the stuff they talk about from that perspective of like what's even in Wikipedia before you get into a bunch of studies and randomized control trials. So I
The
just
broad
like,
perspective.
yeah, I just like to start there, because then a lot of times they have references to studies
Mhm.
and things like that. And, like that's often a good starting point. And Wikipedia surfing is fun when you have time, but you can definitely get lost in it, where say you're just like learning about anything, right? You just start reading about it on Wikipedia, and then you're going to click on something else that's a link that's in there inevitably, and then that takes you to another topic, and that's become fun for me actually. But it's something that can be time consuming. So if you have like something that you really want to do, then maybe you don't do that. But the
Mhm.
writing process will get me into that, where it's like, okay, well now I'm researching. I don't have a timeline for what I'm writing. So it might be a blog somewhere. It might be something I'm trying to offer to, get me an audience, but I don't really have like a specific timeline with it. And then that helps my learning process.
Mhm. I was gonna say, so when you sit down to write, like, do you have a goal in mind of who you're writing to, or are you just writing for yourself, or are you literally just being like, this is what's on my mind, I want to sit down and put this to paper?
Well, that's all part of my process right now. Like, I know the things I need to get better with. Like,
Uh-huh.
I need to get better at communicating to a more general pop audience, or figuring out who the hell I'm talking to, right?
Mhm.
So, like, I think if I'm writing to you, you would like my writing, because you're very interested in, you already know my thought process, and I know who you follow. But I don't think that's a lot of people, right? And like Bill talks about the 16% and things like that. So I have to get better at defining, am I talking to a 16% population, or am I talking to a gen pop? And I think sometimes I'm like in between. So that's from an audience perspective. I don't think about that enough, maybe to build an audience, but to just write and like have myself learn. Yeah, I'll have an idea of like, this is something I'm telling my clients, this is valuable, but then I may get a little too deep in it when I'm writing. So then it ends up taking on a much longer form blog than would be helpful, and it may not have an audience other than myself. So
Yeah.
that definitely happens. But the process is still valuable nonetheless, because even in failing that way, right, where I put something out there and it misses an audience, then I can learn the next time. So I do think the key is for me at this point, like, that I write consistently, because
Mhm.
I gain a lot of value from it. I actually enjoy the process when I do it. When I'm in the structure of it, I really enjoy that process. It's sort of the anticipation to say, oh, I got to sit down and do it. So once it is happening more consistently, sort of like working out, you get into a flow of saying, okay, I can see the value of it.
Right. That makes sense. And how long do you, like, I know you've said you've been trying to just put things into your schedule so that you make yourself do it. Like, how much do you try to write?
30 minutes or a half hour, or sorry,
Okay.
30 minutes or an hour. Yeah, it's the same
Okay.
thing. Right? On the weekends, sometimes a little bit more. Like when I was writing my book, I would do like 2 hours every day on the weekend for a while.
Yeah.
But now I have other stuff that I also want to throw in there on the weekends. Like I might want to update my newsletter, and I'm scheduling all that in there, and that's becoming a form of writing too. I want to try to be better at what I write on the newsletters, and not just make it about blogs. But if I just give myself that schedule, that becomes less of a anxiety to have to write. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't know if you were this way in school, but whenever we had a paper to write, I always thought like that was just very anxiety producing, where it's like
Mhm.
this deadline was going to sink in, and I still have a little bit of a aftermath of that in my head when I have to write. But to take deadlines out of it, I think is really valuable. And sometimes people need that, but I'm my own boss. When you're in school, if you're writing something or doing something that's content for you that you're going to build slowly over time, you won't have that deadline.
Yeah.
You'll just think of it as being curious. And I guarantee if you do that more on your own, like you start writing blogs, you start doing some content without a lot of pressure on yourself,
Yeah.
it makes what you have to do in school all the more fun, or at least easier to do, because you'll be in the flow of writing and it won't feel as anxiety producing.
Yeah. How do you balance, like, I think I get so caught up in consuming things and just trying to process it. It's like how do you go about creating a balance between consuming information but then giving yourself time to process it and then sort of produce information that are your thoughts? And I know obviously you've done this for a while now, but that's something I struggle with.
Well, I mean, we're in different situations, obviously, too. So you're going to take that. You may want to do a lot more just consuming of information at this point, and just dip your toe in the water of the building your own model content thing. But I do recommend that you start thinking about that process, because that's probably the thing that you're not doing. You are doing a lot of consuming of information, and I think there is a tendency when you're a student to say, like, I got to wait for a certain amount of time or a certain time in my career before I start, putting stuff out there. No, you don't. Like, think of it as a resume. You're building your resume. There's no better resume than demonstrating that I'm actually going above and beyond, even if what you're doing is crap at first. You know what I mean? It's just like, if I'm looking at somebody coming in for a job interview and they're a physical therapy aide, and they have a YouTube channel, they have a podcast, it's like, I don't even care what it is. It's like, this person's taking care of their shit, right? Yeah. So that's going to be a resume builder for you, and you're figuring things out, right? Like, you can't expect that much from someone who doesn't have experience, but you're gaining experience in things that therapists that are of an older generation will never get. So you're already offering something unique that even people with more experience aren't offering. So keep that in mind. So I think that is something for you to just dip your toe into, and then you might find that, okay, now I want to spend more time doing this, and that's when you have to start just scheduling it. My personal way of dealing with this, and it always changes, is I do so much audio stuff that it becomes very obvious, like, that's when I'm going to gather information, when I'm doing stuff where I can't be writing. So when I'm working out now, especially when I'm trying not to psych myself out, it's actually helpful for me to listen to a podcast instead of putting on Five Finger Death Punch. So that's a different experience, right? And I like that experience, but if I'm trying to just stay a little bit more, matter of fact about my workouts, it's good to just listen to a podcast. If I feel like I missed something, I'll just, rewind it. But I just, gather information that way, whether it's audiobooks or podcasts. Documentaries are also helpful. Like, so if I'm just trying to, like, watch some TV, like, if I can watch a documentary about something that's pretty interesting or connected to what I do, that's a way for me to get in some of my, like, cardio or not cardio, but even like aerobic stuff. Like, I'll do some steps and I'll jog in place, I'll shadow box just to get some movement in while I'm doing that. So that's like the collecting of information, and there's specific times that fit with that. Right. Where the actual doing, I have to schedule that into my workday, right? So you don't have a workday like I do right now, right? You're gonna have a duties as a student. So if you can start to schedule in, all right, this is when I have to go to class, this is when I'm gonna work on my content, right? This is when I'm gonna take in information. Then you actually want to write that on your schedule. But you know how you work. I work based on a schedule because I have clients, and I'm going to be there when my clients are there, right? Or I don't get paid. But what you start to realize is that you become a bit of a slave to your schedule. So if you put some stuff on there that you don't have to do, that's not not mandatory, you'll start doing that too, because you'll make it part of your workday, and that takes a little bit of time. Something as simple as just, if you want to wake up earlier, right? Just write something you want to do first thing in the morning on your schedule. And it's like, it's just a reminder. It's like, okay, this is important for me. Like, as soon as you think about not doing it because you wrote it on the calendar, it's like a little contract with your So that would be something to figure out. Whatever you want to do, write it down before the time comes that you actually have to do it. And then it sort of eases the anxiety of saying, like, when the moment comes, you have to make a decision.
Yeah.
You've already made the decision when you wrote it down.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That ties into the whole like building habits kind of thing.
Yeah. And that all, I think people underestimate that. And that's, again, going back to psychology, which is, big in the psychology world of looking at behaviors, the psychology of behaviors. And it's a lot of little stuff that we take for granted. We don't think it's important until you actually do it on a regular basis, and you realize, oh, it's super important. Mm-hmm. Right? So when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to most things in health that are not being given to you by someone else, right? So it doesn't take a lot of habit or planning to take medicine. It doesn't take a lot of habit to go and schedule a massage, but even in doing that, like, you're scheduling it, right? So just having that on your schedule, well, that's better than being completely sedentary, because at least you're getting out and having someone working on your body. And that's why a lot of people do personal training. They have a schedule that's just, they don't want to have to think about, if they can afford it, that's very helpful to them. And then it's, they're putting themselves in the hands of a professional. But no matter how much you try to teach someone how to do stuff on their own, they might not be interested in it. And I understand that, because they're just like, no, that I'm outsourcing at least this time on a schedule. And that can be very valuable for people. So you can think of it the same way when you're trying to learn. If there's something that you're interested in, then just make it a schedule, like schedule an appointment, even if it's an appointment with you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure. That all is important, and it builds up over time. Then you start to figure out how to manipulate that over time. Like, you have your own system of behavioral building.
Mm-hmm. It's funny just thinking about habits and stuff, how, like, at first when it is a choice, it's so much harder. And then eventually you get to a point where it's like for me, whether it's like sitting and practicing whatever, mindfulness, meditation, or working out, it's like nothing. Like, I don't even think about it. It's just like, yeah, this is part of my day.
You're right.
This is what I do the first thing I wake up. Like, yeah. But
and the thing I would say about that is, there's a difference to me between habits and routine. And I think this goes back to the idea of having a general concept more than very specific. Mm-hmm. So if you have the same routine for your whole life, think of all the stuff you're missing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's all I would say about that. But if you have a very general idea about things that are super important, like you have broad concepts. So I have a history of looking into Buddhism and practicing through meditation. It's been super valuable in my life. But I wouldn't consider, like, there are people that are Buddhists that would just, we would probably clash in our mindset. But I would say that the things that I've gotten from Buddhism is this idea of broad categories that are just everywhere. Mm-hmm. And they're just, if you look deep enough, you see them everywhere. And if you can, and that's why I think people are religious in many ways, right? They find that in different religions and spiritualities. It's, you can find these overarching principles that just can carry you through almost everything. And then you use your behaviors to deal with that, right? So, like, prayer in a way can be coming back to this idea of what are these foundational morals that I want to try to maintain? Is it gratitude, right? Is it, if a higher power, it's like egolessness, right? So to have somebody that you feel is looking down on you means that you're not the shit in the world, right? You're not God if someone else is God.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of basic principles there. So in Buddhism, for me, and this isn't going to be for everybody, but it's just this idea of non-judgment, I think, just pervades everything. So that big broad category is what helps me stay open to any learning process too, because I know if I'm judging something, I'm full of shit. Like, I know it but it's constant that I'm going to be judging things. You know what I mean? And I feel like there's a bit of human nature to that, but just having that as a broad principle that, you might meditate on, but just that you're contemplating on a regular basis, you know, when you feel right about something and you feel passionate about something, that you're probably full of shit somewhere. So you just, and that just will be that'll just pervade everything. So the other things are like things like compassion and love, and that sounds really corny, but just thinking about it as like loving kindness, being kind, like that's also going to tie into give someone the benefit of the doubt. You'll probably be a better learner. Like you'll get more out of learning. If you're going into a process where you're trying to prove someone wrong, then you've already gone into that process not wanting to learn. Like you want to be the teacher. You don't want to be the learner. And that happens a lot. And you'll find it happening in you at the more experience you get with different things, because you'll start to take on someone else's model as law. And then somebody else contradicts it. And then you're like, well, you didn't think about this. You're wrong. Things like that. And then you can't get anything out of that experience. So it was a waste of your time. So just feeling like, okay, I'm very passionate about something. And that can feel very good, right? Like that can feel like this adrenaline rush. Just to not be ride it out, whatever it is, but just don't think of it as truth, right? Because there's something underneath there that you're probably missing that you don't even know. Like you haven't learned, so you don't know what you're missing. But I think that's a big part of these broad principles. So when you're thinking about routines, a lot of times you start to think like, well, this routine is working, so it's right. And instead of thinking of, okay, I just want to make sure that I'm doing things to promote these broad principles. And I think that's very different.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about just thinking you're right, judging other, like it just comes to mind is like all these Instagram like comment wars pretty much that are just going back and forth between like people that are probably saying somewhat of the same thing just with different language.
Yeah.
But
I think audience building and learning are two different things too.
Yeah.
Just keep that in mind. Like, and what's your intention? So, right, like if you're thinking from a non-judgmental perspective, even the shit that rubs you the wrong way, don't judge it and understand its intent. So if you look at somebody who's just saying stuff that you just totally don't agree with, or they're being very judgmental, don't judge their judgmentalness, because they may have a very specific intent that is good for their business. And I think that's good to be able to step out of like, do what you want to do for that moment. And like, you're not full of shit if you're doing that. You might be just doing what's best for you in the long run, right? Like you can wear different hats.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily matter what you're not going to please everybody, right? You're not even going to please yourself all the time. So just be able to be like mindful of like, am I doing this for something that I feel like has a specific intent, or am I being driven by emotion? Right. And I think that happens. And you may never know when somebody posts something on Instagram what their intention is. It might just be like, this is a nice little algorithm that works for me. When I piss people off, I get a lot of followers. It probably makes sense that it happens. And I've
got someone in mind right now. So
I think I have several people in mind. But I kind of wish I had more of that in me sometimes. Like I get very uncomfortable being contradictory or actually like being argumentative. So even if I like don't agree with something, I really am very careful about my wording, and I take like way too long to write something, and then it becomes like it's just like a waste of my time sometimes. So then I give up on like reading stuff that bothers me. And there's a lot of value in being on discussion boards and going back and forth with people and disagreeing with people. But sometimes like I get too into it. Like I want to make sure I'm not coming off like an asshole, that I take so long. I end up writing like a blog post when I'm trying to get back to somebody on something I don't agree with, that it just ends up not being worth my time.
Yeah. Well, it's hard because it's like you want to get your thoughts across without just pissing someone off, and then having them just becoming fully emotionally driven, and then it just becomes like a, I don't know, personal attack at some point.
Exactly. And but I also think like I disagree with a lot of stuff that's out there, but I also agree with the same people on many things, right? And I think that's a healthy thing to have. Like every individual in your life, you should both agree and disagree with them somewhere.
Yeah.
right? Depending on how much you know them, but you should definitely do that with the people that are putting content out there. Like find a place where you disagree with them, the people that you're worshiping, right? The people that are your gurus. Like try to find a place where you disagree with them, like just to see, and then explore that, right? Explore that deeper, like where you disagree, right? Because that might be where you make yourself unique, right? But that also might be something that you have to look deeper into, and then you find like a common ground.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that kind of ties all into creating your own model, because it's like if you pick from people you've learned, but then there's things you don't agree with, and then it eventually sort of forms into your own thought process.
Absolutely.
In a way.
Absolutely.
In terms of like starting to create content, how would you recommend going about that? Just write it? You think writing is the best place to start?
Yeah, I think it depends on what your situation is, but I think for a student, writing is really valuable because it's a slower process. And then as you start writing, then you'll do video content oftentimes within that writing, especially if you're writing about anything that's kinesthetic, like movement oriented, then you might as well say, oh, this is just going to be easier if I do a video. But writing will get your thoughts in order a lot better. I don't recommend that you make it about trying to get as much content out as possible. I would make it about just starting a process and then being patient with it. Right. So if you start earlier, it's easier to be patient.
Right. Makes sense.
But, I don't know. This is not a business spiel, right? This is more of a learning discussion. And I just think you'll get a lot more out of that by not making it about trying to gain an audience or just put a lot of stuff out there all the time. Like you might get to a point though where you just start feeling more comfortable with that, and it's like you get a rhythm. And you just keep getting ideas where it's like, okay, this is like an easy, quick video. This is a blog post, and depending on how much time you have and what other responsibilities you have, then maybe it's just you're crushing it. You know what I mean? Yeah. But start with the idea of no deadline and just write about something that you think you're talking about a lot, or people that are in your life that you have, like you might have a casual conversation about fitness and you have to explain things. Like you don't want to write to a physical therapist, right? Like you want to write to somebody who's less knowledgeable than you. And there's always somebody who's less knowledgeable than you. But maybe you don't even want to write only about physical therapy stuff. You want to write about the history of injuries that you've had. Right. And connecting that to you being a physical therapy student, right? Or about lacrosse, right? Like stuff that you already feel solid with and you've had a lot of experience with, but then just add a little bit of a piece that, okay, what makes you unique? Well, I'm also a physical therapy student, but I'm a college lacrosse player too, and I've had ACL injuries. Right? So, and then the more things that you become entwined in, right? So, say you get into meditation and mindfulness deeper, well, that becomes something that you can then connect to the other things that you know. And it's not going to be like one thing that you're specialized in. It's the combination of things that you're finding value in that I think will make you unique. And even when you're young and you don't have experience with like your specific profession yet, you'll still have the experience with what makes you you.
Yeah, absolutely. I've gone like through my head. I've sat down to write a few times just with the intent of like I want to put thoughts to paper. But I struggle because I'm like I would love to just start putting things out there, not even a lot, just like a little bit. But like I think it's where I struggle is I'm like, well, how do I create value that's distinct from so that I'm not just mimicking what someone else says. And at that point I just have started writing. I just try to keep writing, and eventually I find myself at a slightly different point of thought than like when I sat down, but I got away from it somewhat recently, so I should get back into it. But
yeah, and you can think of it as journaling initially, right? There's a lot of people that will swear by, just journal every day, write in a journal, whether it's pen and paper or, now you can do it with apps. But you can just separate it from content and just say, all right, I'm going to just journal, right? But I might have a specific concept that I'm putting down, like it's just total rough draft, like no intention of having anyone see it, and then see what builds from there. But write about the things that like you had a very unique background of having someone talk to you about PRI and those concepts in your playing career. So you were thinking about them when you were playing, and you were doing some of those movements for your own rehab while you were going through it. So just diary that, right? Just write about that process. Don't write to me, write to your teammates, your former teammates, or someone else that would have been you before you knew that stuff. Right. And I think that becomes huge. You know what I mean? I struggle with that too, where it's like I'm listening to people that I really respect, and they're, I just keep hearing gems of information from them, and then anything I write down I feel like is stealing their thoughts. But that's where you have to realize, like, you definitely have your own unique place there too. And when you start listening to people enough, you're like, okay, like that's somewhere where I think I can add my value. Is like I look at this slightly differently. It's not like a fundamental disagreement, but it's just like I would maybe use different language here, or I can see how this would get misinterpreted by a different population. Someone who's not the 16%, right, or something like that. So maybe and that's like if you're watching someone like Bill, right? His content is specifically for that 16%, right? So don't write for the 16%, right? Write for everybody else, and then you don't have to worry about that that kind of thing. But even with anyone else you're listening to, you just want to write like something that is you've experienced,
right?
And then see what comes out of that. Like if you have an idea or a thought process that might be based in some type of scientific study, you may want to then research that scientific study so you have a better hold on the things that are being theorized. Then you start to put some references to what you're thinking about. So that's what I would just get started there, and there's no rush. But I know you're dedicated to this process, and I think you'll find school a lot more entertaining if you're connecting it to that idea of building content, because it makes you feel like you're basically more of a professional already. Like it's not like, oh, I'm going to be done with school and that's when my life starts. Like you're already giving yourself the opportunity to maybe build a business later on. So it's like you're kind of already working. Like you're starting the process of marketing, and then it doesn't become this thing where it's like I just got to endure school so I can get my license. Right.
And then it's a slower process too, with learning how to market and do all of that. And you're starting it earlier, and like you said, then you can be more patient with it.
Yeah, because you're not going to take the right course. Right.
I hadn't thought about it really that way that much, so that's very helpful for me to think about, especially like timing couldn't be more perfect. So
right, that's why I figured it would be good to bring some of these topics up as you're going into it. And it's sort of me pouring out some of my regret from when I was in college, because I feel like I really wasted a lot of the learning opportunity to be at a university, just on just doing the school part. And I made sure I took care of business there, but then I just really didn't take advantage of learning anything more in the process. And I've had to do that. I've had to do that, throughout my career. So, maybe started with a bit of a handicap, just because it was like, as soon as I started in the workforce, that's when I really started thinking about learning as an important thing, right? Everything else was just about getting to a point where I could work, right? I can make money or something like that. And now I realize, like, learning is your ticket. You know what I mean? Like, the more you know, the more you set yourself apart, the more, especially in our field, like you're going to make more money doing that because the base jobs won't pay you as much as if you're like unique and you can sell yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Yeah.
At least where we are now, and I don't see that.
Right. Yeah. Right. No, this has been incredibly helpful. So yeah.
I'm glad. Yeah, and just let me know if you need anything else as you go through this process. I look forward to you getting into school, and so we can chat about what you're learning.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it should be interesting, especially because it's just like 3-week long units at a time. And so we'll see. But I'm excited. Yeah.